Okay. So this is part of Raven's legacy project that he's going to be showing at the 50 year. And we have a number of questions, but we have a little bit more time. I got a gauge for what the interview time roughly is after interviewing Duke Heinrich. So to start with, if we could start with your name and then what your title was, or your name and title in the SCA.
Okay. My name is Count Richard Ironsteed in the SCA, and my title is Count. Funniest thing about that.
And your name outside of the SCA?
Rick Cook.
Okay.
Now, the most important thing you have to know about the SCA down here is that when we founded it, none of us knew what we were doing. We were making it up as we go along. And as a result, people talk about the ancient and sacred traditions, and I kind of boggle. Because, yeah, right, I remember when that tradition was established. I remember how sober we were, too. And that's sometimes an issue.
Just adjust this slightly.
Yeah. Demographically, the important thing about Atenveldt was that at 25 and 26, Mike Reynolds and I were the old men. Most of the members were in high school or college. And like I say, we made it up as we went along.
Okay, so from what I understand, you were the first King of Atenveldt.
I was the first King of Atenveldt. I was one of the co-founders of Atenveldt. This was supposed to be a fanzine.
Really?
Yes. What happened was that in 1968, I went up to the San Francisco WorldCon, BayCon, World Science Fiction Convention. Now that particular WorldCon has gone down in history as the most gonzo event in science fiction history. And one of the reasons it was so gonzo, aside from the wedding cake of a hotel, was that the SCA was out in force for the first time. And so all these people wandering around the halls wearing swords. You could tell the people that usually stayed at the hotel, because they were the ones that shrank back against the wall. Somebody walked by with a sword. But as part of that, I got introduced to the SCA. And I thought it was really neat. So I picked up a copy of what was then the Known World Handbook, which was about 40 pages mimeographed and stapled together, and along with some other stuff, and I brought it back to Phoenix. Well, nobody was interested. I couldn't get any traction on it. And as it happened, I was working at the Scottsdale Progress at the time, the newspaper.
Okay.
And Mike Reynolds was the sports editor. We were friends. Well, the next year, I went to WesterCon, and I came back full of stories about science fiction conventions and stuff like that, and also with a bunch of fanzines. And we decided to start a fanzine. So to give Mike an idea, because Mike didn't know anything about science fiction conventions or fandom. So to give him an idea of what it was about, I gave him a stack of fanzines that I'd collected in the last year or two. In there was the handbook. So anyway, he comes back a couple of days later, and he holds up the handbook, and he says, I got a better idea. Let's do this instead. And that was the genesis of Atenveldt. Now, as to whether it was a better idea or not, that is highly debatable, but it's the one we went for. And from then on, for years, in times of stress or turmoil, one of us would look at the other and say, let's start a fanzine. Well, we never got around to the fanzine, but the group took off, and one thing led to another, and here we are coming up on 50 years later.
The interesting thing for me is that a lot of the questions I have the premise that what we take for granted as traditions and policies, procedures, what have you, are well established when I'm going to be interviewing a lot of these people. And my first interview was Duke Heinrich, and so I knew for a fact that, like, tell me about your first event. Well, what's the first event? What do you want to know?
Yeah, right. We got together in somebody's backyard.
And so I understand that you were there for that event, though, as well.
Not for the first SCA event.
Okay.
I didn't get into the SCA until 1969.
Okay.
It had been going at that point up in the Bay Area for about 3 years. What we did have was we were the first branch that wasn't established by apostolic succession. In other words, by somebody from the West moving someplace and starting an SCA branch.
So that's how the East and the Mid-Rome got started then?
Yeah, they were both started by people who come from the West. And so we were the first that wasn't. And a lot of the policies, or a lot of the, yeah, I guess you could call them policies, were things that were kind of made up for us, including the idea of being a barony. Because the board was making it up as they went along too.
Right.
So, and we were kind of the guinea pigs for that. And now the problem with that was that we didn't have a lot of traction with the board. And the board at that point was an interesting entity. You hear people today complain about the board. Not without reason. But believe me, it is night and day from what we had to deal with then. And they would come up with these bright ideas, and they would issue, not a proclamation, but they would say, okay, this is the way it's going to be. Now, the thing was that the other kingdoms, especially the West, were smart enough to either ignore them when they got too rambunctious, or pressure them into changing their mind. We didn't know enough to do that. And consequently, we were desperately trying to follow these policies that they would come up with off the top of their heads. And the policies weren't set in stone, because if the people in the West objected strongly enough, policy changed. And that was kind of a mess. The classic example of this is something that happened to me when I was Marshal of the Society. And that is, at a tournament, I was sitting around talking with 2/3 of the board. There were only 3 members. And they informed me that women weren't allowed to fight in the SCA. And being young and stupid, I took that as gospel and tried to enforce it, which made me real unpopular. Of course, the board backed off as soon as people put pressure on. But by that time, I was out there as the front man on a policy I didn't agree with anyway. But it was that kind of thing. The history of the SCA is a lot more loosey-goosey than most people realize. This was never a well-organized bunch. And it still isn't to a large extent, but it's much better organized today than it was then. So we, like I say, we made up a lot of it as we went along.
Okay. So as you're going along, at some point you got an award of arms, or they created the concept of an award of arms.
Well, they had the concept of an award of arms.
Tell me about that.
Well, how I got it?
Or how they created it and then how you got yours.
Well, I don't know how they created it. I wasn't around for that.
Okay.
But I got mine at 12th Night in the West, along with a case of food poisoning, but what the heck. And it was, got a very nice scroll for it. I still got it. I mean, it was nice for the time. It was nothing as elaborate as what you get today, which is, God, you got some incredibly talented artists and calligraphers. And but it looked really nice. I mean, for a while down here, we were doing our scrolls with felt tip markers. I've got a couple of those too. But it was basically what had happened was that by that time we had the group down here well started, and the King of the West and some others figured that we needed some recognition for that. And so both Mike Reynolds and I got awards of arms, which was a big deal. I mean, understand that we didn't have a good way to give kingdom level awards down here.
At that time, this was still the barony of Atenveldt.
Well, it was the barony for a while, then it was a principality, because we wanted to become a kingdom to get as independent as we could from the people in the West, especially the board. And so we pushed our way through the ranks from barony to, I don't know how long we were at barony, it wasn't very long, to principality, and then from that to kingdom, which was a story.
Tell me about that story.
Well, okay, I was the first king, right? This was another accident, because I showed up that day without most of my equipment, not thinking I'd fight. And then I got there and I decided, oh, what the hell. So I borrowed a bunch of stuff, including one of the original helms, and borrowed a sword from a guy. Went out there and fought. Now, dirty little secret is, I wasn't very good. On the other hand, neither was anybody else. So it kind of evened out. But I was also left-handed. And a left-handed fighter in the SCA has an advantage, because to defend against him, you have to do things backwards. And most people, left or right-handed, aren't used to that. Now that's, of course, much less true today, because the fighters are much more experienced and generally better trained. But in our time, it was a big deal. So here I am, out there, and I go through, win a couple of fights, and then I came up against a friend of mine who was also left-handed. And we proceeded to double kill, and double kill, and double kill. Finally, more by luck than anything else, I got in on him. And I wandered around. Well, I was exhausted. So I'm sitting over on one of the picnic tables at the park, and the herald announces, so-and-so will fight so-and-so and the winner will fight Sir Richard Ironsteed for the crown. And I go, what? So I ended up fighting Tom the Traveler and winning. And the next thing I knew, A, I was king, B, the bagpiper was playing the song I asked for, and C, I was surrounded by a bunch of Zagnuts, the House Sagamore, which is a female household. And the woman that I had fought for was, just a casual friend, but she asked me to carry her favor, and I did. And I remember looking at her and realizing the meaning of that expression, deer in the headlights. I understand I had the same expression on my face. Because, of course, this led to another round of improvisation. Because there really wasn't any manual or anything on how to be king. And so again, we made it up.
So, after your, tell me something about your first reign that you found memorable or enjoyable.
Well, let's see. I enjoyed making it up.
What were some of the things you made up? You're like, that sounds like a good idea. Let's do that.
Yeah. Well, one thing was the first baronial award, which was the Order of Light. I didn't come up with the idea for the award, but I did come up with the medallion, the insignia of the order. The way that came about was I had just gotten a Florentining tool, and I wanted to try it out, so I got some little discs of copper from the candy craft store, and I used the tool to cut lines into it, so it kind of sparkled. And this became the Order of Light. And I made about a half dozen of them, and then other people took over, and I don't know, the modern design is nothing like that. But that's what we started with. Oh yes, processionals. We'd gotten the idea of processionals from the West. Now, that only works when you've got a fairly small group. And with the SCA, it doesn't work well even then. And I remember at one of the tournaments I reigned over, because everything ran late, of course. I was bound and determined that this was going to come off on time. So as people were forming up on the processional, I'm standing in front of the throne looking at my watch going, 10, 9, 8, counting it down. And it did start on time. Everybody thought I was weird, but it started on time. Now, some of the traditions that we followed were negative. The West, for reasons best left undiscussed, had a tradition of courts of chivalry when somebody had done something wrong. Well, we saw how that had worked, and we decided early on that there would be no courts of chivalry in Atenveldt. We weren't going to go there. And that is one of the traditions that's worked out very well. What were some of the other things we did? Ah, yes. It was during my reign that we discontinued the Inebriate Award.
Okay.
That was the award for the person who got the most swinishly drunk at a revel, which, when you're young and stupid, seems like a good idea. Now, one of the one of the problems was none of us, or at least almost none of us, were heavy drinkers. And we discovered mead, or at least a substance we called mead, because it was sometime after that before we discovered wine yeast. So the early batches of wine were made with baker's yeast.
Okay.
No, it's not okay.
Oh, tell me why.
Number one, it looks terrible because it's cloudy. It won't clear. Number two, mead has even good mead, which this wasn't. The joke was it was fine old mead aged in the car on the way to the tourney. But mead has the characteristic, because it's sweet and pleasant, and you don't realize how drunk you're getting. In fact, you keep getting drunk for about half an hour after you stop drinking. So there was a lot of drunkenness. And we quickly discovered that we didn't need to encourage that kind of behavior at all. So we dropped the inebriate award. It's like at one time the West had an award called the Mucking Great Club, which was a big club that they gave to the guy who hit the hardest in the tournament. Well, after some of the members started using their karate and aikido training, we decided, the West decided, that award was not a good idea. Because one of the other problems was armor, as in there weren't none. We had, when we started out here, started fighting, we had 2 helms, which we'd gotten from the West, that were made of fairly thin metal. They were padded with foam that could be pulled out so you could beat the dents out of the helms, which was necessary. And basically that was it. That and a cup, and you were declared fully armored. Now, if you were smart, you quickly put together additional pieces of armor, usually by looking at where you got most badly bruised in the last tournament.
That leads me to the question of Seymour.
Oh, God. How do I put this? There are some people who really get into certain aspects of the SCA, and Charles of the Jacks was one of them, and he wanted a full suit of plate. So he made Seymour, which was impressive when he clanked out on the field. And also led to another tradition. He used to have the first fight at every tournament because they had declared that it took jacks or better to open. And one of the guys he fought, Ivanov von Schloss, had a Roman persona. And so he'd get out there in his Roman outfit versus Seymour, and they'd fight the first fight. Now, there was one little problem with this. Chuck had decided that when it was time for him to die, he would fall on his opponent. And, you know, Chuck's kind of a big guy. And all that armor, and I don't know if this was a ploy to discourage people from killing him or not, but it was spectacular.
After being king, tell me about an event that you probably held or helped run that was something special to you.
Oh, Lord. In a way, it was all special to me.
How?
Because, well, I was so deeply involved in it. I was doing everything. And, you know, I was working behind the scenes more than I was working out in front of them. I do remember one tournament during my reign. It was held at a private house out in Scottsdale. It was a horse place, and they had plenty of acreage. They had a big corral, which we used as a fighting field. However, like most corrals, it had been decorated by the horses. So the first thing we had to do was get out there and rake up all the road apples. And I remember being out there raking up horse shit. And some people felt this was a little undignified. I felt it was something that had to be done. I wasn't wearing the crown. That part of the story is untrue. But it was a matter of, you know, it had to be done. And for the first several years of the society, if something had to be done, I was right there to do it. I was young. I was stupid. I didn't know how to delegate. And speaking of that story brings up another point that's probably of interest to your viewers, and that is that one of the traditions of Atenveldt is, if you have a choice between a good story and the truth, go with the good story, always. As a result, there is more damn hagiography in this organization than you can shake a stick at. And you're probably going to hear a fair amount of it today. So just keep in mind that if it's a good story, it ain't necessarily so.
That's awesome.
Yeah, well.
Before, because you mentioned you were behind the scenes a lot, before you were king, was there any officer position that you held that is memorable?
Yeah. The short answer is all of them.
Okay.
Everything but Seneschal. Mike was the Seneschal. Mike was always a far better organizer and had more push than I did. And in fact, Atenveldt exists because of Mike. I was, Mike Cady called me the George Washington of Atenveldt. This is incorrect. Mike Reynolds was the George Washington of Atenveldt. I was, at best, Sam Adams or Tom Paine.
Okay.
But we didn't. Basically, it was a matter of we did what needed to be done. And in the early days, that included training the fighters under the title of Lanista rather than Knight Marshal. Being the herald, because I got a loud voice. And, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And anything else that needed doing.
Okay. Because you were also around for the founding of Atenveldt as a barony, tell me about that investiture. What was it like to see it become a barony?
It wasn't. There was no investiture. The board said,
tournament?
no. The board said, Domini, 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 you're a barony. And that was the end of it. And I don't think they understood at the time what they were starting. I think we were the first barony in the SCA. Not we were the second. And it was just a term to describe a branch. Now later on they established criteria for membership numbers and so forth. But that was later.
Is there an investiture of a barony that you remember in the kingdom that was special or at least memorable?
Not really. You know, there's a sense in which I did a lot of this in the days. You know, I was so busy doing the day-to-day stuff that I didn't pay a lot of attention to a lot of things.
Okay. The first coronation you attended, I assume, was somewhere in the West.
No.
Was it yours then?
Yes.
Oh.
I told you we were making this up.
Okay. I thought you might have attended maybe one of the Western kings at the time.
No. We only went over to the West. I only went over to the West a couple of times. And part of the reason was that because we were carrying so much stuff, armor and etc., we had to drive. And even in those days of 80-mile-an-hour speed limits, that's a long drive. Especially if you didn't do it over a holiday weekend, which we frequently didn't. So we would drive all night, attend the tournament, crash someplace, and then drive back Sunday afternoon and get in here Monday morning.
You didn't start all over again.
No, we didn't do that very often.
Okay, good.
Because it took too much out of us. And also there was the matter of reliable transportation.
Okay. Are there any of the investitures of the kings or queens of Atenveldt that you did attend that you found memorable?
Again, my successors.
Okay, tell me.
Well, no, it was simply a matter of, I'm getting out of this. Congratulations, it's now your problem. And the truth of the matter is that even in those days, being king was such a job that smart people didn't want to do it twice. Of course, if you did it twice, you became a duke. And for some people, that outweighed being smart. And then some people just got off on crown tournaments.
Yeah, I know a few.
Mm-hmm.
I remember hearing the story once before, but I think our viewers would appreciate it if you would tell us how you chose your heraldry. And if you could describe it briefly for them as well.
Okay. My arms are quarterly azure and argent, a horse rampant sable. That's a black horse on a blue and white field.
Okay.
Now, that's another bit of legendary. It is not true that I chose the black horse because it was the Ferrari emblem. The horse was an afterthought because they wouldn't let me have quarterly azure and argent. Now, I wanted quarterly and azure and argent because that's the insignia of the BMW. And I rode BMW motorcycles.
Okay.
So, you know, like everything else, it was just a casual thing. And,
where did the horse come from then?
Well, Ironsteed. Iron horse.
I was thinking of trains and railroads a lot of the time when I heard your name.
Motorcycles.
Ironsteed. Okay, I get it. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Now, I know a lot of the SCA would grow because we would attend demos and at schools or military bases and what have you. Was there a demo that you did, performed, or were just in attendance at that meant a lot to you? Or was it at least funny and you remember it?
Well, I remember it. We embarrassed ourselves on television.
Great, tell us about that.
Well, Mike and Chuck Cady, Charles of the Jacks, Arthur and Lockhaven, used to do a thing, kind of a demo fight, as a rotarius and secutor. In other words, the guy with the trident and net versus the guy in half armor. And we were doing a tournament. And of course, in those days, we were new enough that the news gerbils showed up to film it. And they took a lot of footage, including one of Mike and Chuck doing their gladiator bit. Now, one of the things about that is that in order to win, it's necessary for the secutor, the guy in the armor, to close as fast as he can with the other guy, the Rotarius, the net man, and try to tie him up, get him under the trident, which means that a fight between a Rotarius and a secutor, at least in modern times, starts with a charge as the secutor tries to close in, and the Rotarius is typically backing up. Right? Well, we had a buffet table set at the edge of the tourney field. That was one of the other things we learned. Don't put anything important right next to the tourney field. But anyway, so they performed their "Hail Caesar, we were about to die," and then they started, and Mike, who was playing the secutor, charged Chuck. Chuck backed up, ran backwards into the buffet table, went over it, stuff went everywhere, and you will never guess what showed up on the news that night.
The buffet table.
The buffet table, yes. Yeah, that was memorable.
That's great. So, a lot of people hear that there's a barrier that blocks the fighters from doing any harm to the people who are watching the event.
The Eric.
The Eric. And I'm told there is a story that involves how the Eric came into being.
Well, the Eric was named because the original Eric was done with that, that red plastic tape that
yes.
construction sites use to block something. It's like crime tape, except it's not marked. Okay. So that was put up around it, and because it was red, it became Eric the Red.
Ah.
And that was later shortened to the Eric, especially as a lot of the later ones weren't red.
Right, they became like iron rods and yellow caution tape.
Yeah.
Or flags hung down enough to make it noticeable. Oh, I should not go here.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good thought, except that the fighters are so concentrated on each other that it's the job of the knight marshal to make sure they don't bust out of the Eric.
And hurt the buffet table.
Hurt the buffet table, yes.
Oh, that's great. So obviously you've been to a lot of Australia wars.
A few.
What was your most memorable one?
Oh, God. Well, and that day it wasn't Australia. It was the Burrow Creek War. And it was held up at Burrow Creek Park, which is up toward Kingman. And that was the weekend that we had another one of our 100-year floods.
No.
Yeah, well, at that point we were in a wet cycle. And almost every year we had a 100-year flood. So it's raining cats and dogs. It was raining when we left Phoenix. We barely got out over the bridge before they closed it. And it was raining cats and dogs up at the site. So we set up, and that night was memorable. Not the night we arrived, the next night, Saturday night. Because they had set up a tavern under this big cargo parachute, which made it a good-sized tent. And there wasn't anything else to do. So most of us ended up in the tavern, drinking, singing. Richard Strange was there, Rick Felix, who alas is no longer with us, but he was a great musician. And so I'm singing and drinking and drinking and singing and singing and drinking. And finally, I staggered back to the tent that I was sharing with about 6 other people. This is 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Threw open the flap and announced, "I'm drunk as a skunk." And that was a good memory. That was fun.
It sounds like the bar probably would have fit this next question, but if there was a feast you enjoyed, either for the food or for the people in attendance or the ambiance in general, what would your favorite feast have been?
Well, it wasn't exactly a feast. But at one point, they had an inter-kingdom war over in Redlands, California. And again, the night devolved into a lot of drinking and singing. More singing than drinking, because the beer had to be packed in. But that was very enjoyable.
What about it did you enjoy?
The singing and drinking, of course.
Was there someone that we might know, like Joe Bethencourt, who was singing there, or?
No, Joe wasn't at that. This was, oh, I can't even remember her name. Teron Stephenson's wife.
Valeria, I think?
No.
No, I'm thinking of Trelon. Sorry, my bad.
Yes. Totally different people.
Yep.
But, yeah, she had brought a guitar, and we started. Did you know there are a bunch of SCA verses to the Ball of Ballinor?
I was not aware of that.
Some of them are even clean. Most of them are. But we, oh yeah. Basically what we'd do is we'd sit around singing, make up verses, usually until the musician got too tired to play anymore.
Now I remember at one of the roundtable discussions that we had recently, you talked about meeting your wife at the SCA.
Yes, to both. I met both my wives at the SCA.
Tell us about that.
Well, the first one, I had moved down to Yuma to work as a reporter for the newspaper down there. And she had come down because she had just graduated from college. She was waiting to hear if she was going to get admitted to University College Dublin. And so she was living with her parents. Her father was an engineer on the, what the hell was that? The Cheyenne gunship program.
Okay.
And they were down at the Yuma Proving Grounds trying to get the thing to work. So anyway, I decided I'd start an SCA group for lack of anything better to do. And so I put out an ad, and Catherine, who had been Old and Middle English major, was fascinated, so she came by and joined. And one thing led to another. When we left for Ireland, that group down there sort of fell apart. Marriage didn't last much longer, but that's as it was. Now, the second time, I went to I'd just gotten divorced from Catherine after 7 years of marriage. And I went to an event. Did I mention that I've always liked busty redheads?
No, but I can understand that.
Yes, well, so I went to this event, and there was this gorgeous, busty redhead, just absolutely beautiful. Freckles, green eyes, wonderful. And, I talked to her a little. And then I went around asking people, who is she? Of course, that got back to her. And one thing led to another. And there was an incident at a slightly later event involving a set of car keys and a belly dancing costume. But we won't go into that. So it was, and we've been married for more than 30 years. So it really
That's awesome.
worked out.
Tell me about an award that's special to you. Could be any of them.
Well, the thing about awards, the early days, was we didn't get them, we gave them. And, I've accumulated a few as I've gone along, but it really hasn't been the focus. You've got to understand that because we had invented so many of these things, rank and title and awards mean something very different to me than it does to somebody who's coming into society now. And truth of the matter is they were less important. I mean, it's nice, but, that wasn't what mattered. What mattered more than anything else was character. And that is something you can't fake. And it's something that, unfortunately, a lot of people confuse rank and title and awards with character. And they figure if they get an award or a rank, that that'll somehow make them better. No. The award doesn't change you, but you can play a part in changing the award by your behavior. And so there's differences in the awards and ranks depending on the behavior of the group as a whole that holds them. And that's a very difficult concept to get across to people. That the award doesn't support you. You support the award.
I think that's a powerful message to probably end the interview on. Is there anything else you'd like to, any story or anecdote?
Oh, I can probably think of a few if I try hard enough, but it doesn't really matter. The big thing, well, okay, there is one observation I'd like to leave people with.
Okay.
And that is that the SCA is the biggest pot of medieval stone soup that's ever been cooked. It is the sum total of the actions and the attitudes and the contributions of all the members. It's not about the kings or the princes or the dukes or the counts or the knights. It's about everyone. And everyone working together is what makes the SCA what it is, whatever that is. And it's important, I think, that people keep that in mind. I say we made it up in the beginning. Well, there's a very real sense in which we're still making it up, in which the sum total of the populace is making it happen, making it what it is.
Thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to get to interview you.
Well, thank you.
And I hope you have a wonderful little trip here and enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, thank you.
Thanks very much. Oh, there's one thing I need you to sign real quick. If you can kind of follow along what Heinrich did, but just if you could fill that out for me real quick.
Okay.